party.
Off-brand party.
It's actually about me.
Well, exactly. It's about me, which means that you guys don't matter.
Excuse me, sorry. Whoa, whoa.
One morning, in a small shack deep within a Louisiana swamp, Sister Jones awoke with a start. She looked at her husband and she was a bit uneasy, for she had dreamed of a beautiful wedding. And she had been taught since the time she was little that to dream of marriage was a sure sign of death. Well, Sister Jones laid there and she wondered, who would be the one to pass from this earthly life to the next? Would it be she or her husband Cephas? Well, about a week later, she got her answer. Her husband, who'd been suffering with the consumption, took a turn for the worse and slipped from this life into the spirit world. Now, Sister Jones was sad to see her husband go, but she should have seen it coming, for she had been warned by the dream. The next day, Sister Jones covered all the mirrors in the house because everyone in town knew that if you didn't, the image of the dead would remain in those mirrors. Now, Sister Jones loved her husband, but she didn't want his image hanging around in those mirrors. The next day, Sister Jones buried her husband. Afterwards, she and the mourners were just sitting around the house talking about how they were going to miss poor old Cephas, stubborn though he was, when the front door swung open. A cold breeze filled the entire room, and in walked Cephas. He walked right up to the mourners and said, "What's all this about? Y'all act like somebody's dead. Who's dead?" Well, needless to say, by this time all those mourners jumped up and ran clean out of the house. But the widow Jones, who was still very frightened, managed to blurt out, "Now, Cephas, you know you're dead. Why are you hanging around here in the living room and not the graveyard?" "Dead?" said Cephas. "How come you say I'm dead? I sure don't feel dead." The widow Jones told him, "You may not feel dead, but you sure look dead as can be. You better get back to that graveyard where you belong." Now, even though Cephas was dead, he was still very stubborn. He said, "No, I'm not going back to the grave until I feel dead." And he moved closer to the fire to warm his cold hands and feet, all the while giving the room an icy chill. And from sunup to sundown, day after day, that's all he did, sit by the fire, rocking back and forth. Well, after a few weeks of Brother Cephas just sitting around, things started to get bad in the household. Cephas turned a funny gray color, and he looked real dusty. Every time he'd move, his joints would creak and crack. And as the days wore on, they'd creak and crack more and more. The widow Jones hadn't received any company since her husband's untimely return, and she began to wonder just how long this corpse would last. Now, the insurance money refused to pay the insurance because Cephas declared to everyone that he was not dead. To make matters worse, the undertaker threatened to take the coffin back if Cephas refused to lie in it. Now, the widow Jones needed that insurance money awfully bad, and what's more, she was getting real tired of her husband sitting around the house creaking and cracking. She tried to convince Cephas time and time again to get back into the grave, but each time he'd protest, "Leave me alone. I'm not going back to that burying ground until I feel dead, and I don't feel dead yet." The widow Jones just knew something had to be done. Well, Cephas had been sitting around the house for about a month when one night the best fiddler in town built up enough nerve to go by and visit the widow Jones. He came in and sat on one side of the fire, and Cephas sat on the other, still creaking and cracking, trying to warm his cold hands and feet. The two men exchanged glances and made small talk, as small as a human and a corpse could make. But after a while, it was obvious the two men were rather uncomfortable. By and by, Cephas blurted out, "All this sitting around is boring. Let's the three of us do something fun. How about some music, brother fiddler? Let's dance and limber up our joints a bit." So, still getting used to the idea that he was sitting talking to a corpse, the fiddler got out his fiddle and he started to play. When Cephas heard that music, he jumped up, shook himself about. He started buck dancing around the room. "Now that's more like it," he hollered as he skipped and pranced about, his old rotten bones creaking and cracking even louder than before. For a dead man, he sure could dance. In fact, he danced so hard that the piece of his arm flew loose and fell on the floor. When the fiddler saw that, he stopped playing and said, "Good golly, look at that." But the widow Jones grinned at the sight, an idea coming into her head. "Play faster," she demanded. So the fiddler played faster, and Cephas danced faster. Now by this time, bones went flying everywhere, and the widow kept hollering, "Play faster!" And the fiddler, too frightened to do otherwise, played faster still. Bones dropping all the time, until all at once, Cephas began to crumble to the floor into a big heap of bones. There lay the bones of Cephas, still as they could be, except for his big old bald head. Why, it kept dancing all by itself, just dancing and grinning and bouncing all over the floor. And the widow kept hollering, "Play faster, play faster." And the fiddler plays faster still. Until finally the fiddler wasn't hearing any of it. He said, "Sorry, Sister Jones, I gotta run and get me some rosin for my bow. I'll be right back." I'll have you know that fiddler ran out the door in a flash and has not been seen since. When the fiddling stopped, Cephas's bald head grinned up at his wife and said, "What happened to the music? I want to dance some more."
No.
The widow simply looked at the head and said, "The music has stopped, Cephas, and so have you. You have danced yourself into a big heap of bones, and now it's time for you to go back to the graveyard." Well, Cephas's big old eyes looked around and he noticed he didn't have a body. So he sighed a big sigh and said, "Okay, wife, I guess I do feel dead now. Go on and take me back to the graveyard." So the widow Jones gathered up all the bones and she took them back to the graveyard. But she was real careful this time to lay the bones all crisscrossed, so Cephas wouldn't get up and dance some more. And after that, Cephas didn't get out of the grave anymore. But it is sad to say the poor widow Jones remained a widow the rest of her life. Most folks think it was that dancing head that kept all the men away. Thank you so much. We'll be at Zella's on Wednesday for another free Cranky show. If you want to come, there's flyers in the back of the big tent. And the next Zella's is in Holland's Market in Southwest Baltimore. And there should be another band in the big tent any minute.